Hi, everyone. Welcome to Wandering DMs. I'm Paul.
And I'm Dan. And today we have a very special guest, the legendary Ramsey Campbell, who, if you don't know who that is, I can't believe he agreed to be here, frankly, because he's written over 30 novels, hundreds of short stories. If you don't know who that is, he's the winner of the World Fantasy Award, the Grand Master Award at the World Horror Convention, the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Horror Writers Association, and many others. Ramsey, we're so happy you wanted to spend time with us today.
Hey, my pleasure, guys. My pleasure.
Before we go, is there any award or title or position that you've held that I didn't mention that you're particularly proud of before we go on?
Well, oh gosh, I don't know. Well, I'll tell you the one that did give me great pleasure, which is not an award in the usual sense, but the Liverpool University, the John Moores University, they gave me an honorary fellowship, what they described as outstanding services to literature. Well, that's what they said, not me. But I was very proud of that. And when I did my acceptance speech at a huge cathedral, 2,000 people, I actually said I'd like to accept this on behalf of the horror field as well as just me. So I was proud of it for that too, basically, that kind of, appreciation, if you like.
That's nice. That's very thoughtful of you. I like that a lot. And I guess it occurs to me, I think that what the Oxford Guide to Literature says that you're the most influential living UK horror writer, I think.
Well,
so,
that's assumed I'm living. That's assumed I'm living.
I guess we don't have any real solid proof of that.
I'm just an electronic image, guys. I'm not really here.
I really don't need. Okay, both of you. I don't personally need any more existential terror today. I've got enough on my plate. So. So what we wanted to talk about in particular is this week, in 2 days, Ramsey has a new book coming out. It's called The Way of the Worm, and it is the finale to the Daoloth trilogy, the Three Births of Daoloth. And there's a review in The Guardian this week that says, just briefly, although now better known for his subtler evocations of unease, Campbell's early stories were heavily influenced by HP Lovecraft, and here he returns to his roots, even outdoing Lovecraft in his depictions of full-on cosmic terror. Is that a fair? Do you think that's a fair description, Ramsey, or would you pitch it differently?
Well, I'm very flattered. So hell, I'm not going to brush it off. That's for certain. No, I'm very pleased with it because I have over the good Lord 60 years now in print. I've tried to get that sense of cosmic terror that I love so much in Lovecraft and Blackwood and Machen, others, Ted Klein, Ligotti and so forth. And, every so often I have another go at it. And, I do think the trilogy, I hope, manages to scale a couple more, I wouldn't say peaks of it exactly, but, at least get up the foothills, which is where I shall spring from my next effort, maybe.
Excellent.
Amazing.
So when I read this, I felt it was. Go ahead, Paul.
Oh, I was just gonna say we're big fans of Lovecraft here on the show. Lovecraft's hometown of Providence, Rhode Island. It's about halfway between Dan and I physically. We should meet up there someday, Dan. I'm kind of curious. I was kind of curious just to broad strokes from you, for viewers who maybe aren't super tuned into this. What would you define as cosmic horror? What separates that from other forms of horror?
Well, I suppose something something vaster than our experience, if you like. I think it's a sense of largeness and in the infinite, if you like. Depending, obviously in Lovecraft you get the sense of the infinity of time in something like The Shadow Out of Time. You get the sense of infinite space and the sense that things are completely different elsewhere in something like The Colour Out of Space, which I think are two of his greatest stories. In something like The Willows, Blackwood, I suppose, the Blackwood in particular, I suppose, there's a sense that the entire narrative is a kind of metaphor for something it can't directly describe. It's as if the entire story is a way of conveying something indirectly, but that's larger than the story. It can't be contained by the story. I guess that would be cosmic terror for me.
That sounds like a fascinatingly difficult writing task to describe the undescribable.
Yeah.
Is that what appeals to you about it? Is that like how is that more appealing than say a thriller or something that dwells on sort of just more, I guess, mundane, if you will, horror?
Well, I mean, I find both appealing. I've actually done a few, studies of psychosis and so forth. The Face of Die, very early one, recent stuff like, I don't know, Secret Story. But yes, I have to say what really engages my imagination most is the uncanny. And maybe the larger that is, the better. So yes, I can feel, if you like, my imagination kind of click in or expand, if you like, when I'm writing that kind of thing. And it's always the bit that I particularly enjoy writing in a narrative, if it's in there, And certainly whenever I came upon it in the whole trilogy, then, there was this kind of, a brightening of consciousness, if you like. So there is that excitement of creation and of trying to reach for something you can't quite reach, which I think is one of the essences of cosmic terror, that sense of reaching for, well, I think Fritz Leiber used to use the term wonder and terror. I think the combination of the two, maybe that's what we're really talking about.
It's interesting you mentioned Leiber because, a main plot point of The Way of the Worm is there is a new church that's based in a skyscraper in the now or near future Liverpool called Starview Tower. And to me, that certainly brought to mind Leiber's story, Stardock, featuring Fafford and the Grey Mouser. And I don't know if that was intentional or an echo, but that I was thinking about it while people were in Starview Tower in the book.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it may well be an echo. It wasn't intentional, but then sometimes I find myself writing, Fritz ideas, because he was a great, tremendous writer. A huge influence on me as well. I think Smoke Ghost is an absolutely seminal, sort of crucial turning point in urban supernatural terror. Because, whereas before the ordinary everyday environment would be invaded by the supernatural, in Smoke Ghost it's the source of the supernatural, and that's such an extraordinary turning point. The whole genre of urban terror, I think, grows out of it. Certainly influenced me hugely when I read him when I was, I guess, 16, 17 years old. In fact, we met later on the first World Fantasy Convention. I actually had not me, just me, obviously, but, everybody there had the supreme pleasure of hearing Fritz read The Haunter of the Dark at Midnight in Providence, which, you can't get much better than that. Although, actually, I did, because we did a reading together at Jack Sullivan's apartment in New York the following year. So that was a memorable experience too, for sure.
Wow, that's great. I think do you have an event the next week or two in the UK where you're doing readings? Am I right about that? Like this week or next week?
Yes, actually on the 29th, which is the official publication date in Britain of The Way of the Worm, I'll be doing it at Blackwell's bookshop in Liverpool. So yeah, I'll be reading there at 6:00 in the evening. Yeah. I'm not sure, they might be streaming it. There's some talk of whether they could do that. Let's hope they can.
Ah, that's great. That's great. I was momentarily wishing I was in the UK that week, basically for that event. So if they're streaming that would be great. One of the things I really thought was interesting about the Daoloth trilogy was that you get to tell a generational story. Over the course of the 3 books, we see the main character, Dominic Sheldrake, first as a teenager, and then as a young father, and then in this 3rd book, we see him as a grandfather. And so in this 3rd book, we get to see him dealing with the problems of being aged and the aches and creaks and difficulty sleeping and inability to run away from the terrible things as much as you'd like to be able to do. And also it's interesting that normally in the pulp tradition, once someone has the mind expanding cosmic terror moment, that's the end of the story. And so here we get to see what it's like in that person's life years or decades later after they've had that experience. Was that was that part of what you were trying to bring out? Was that new for you?
Oh, hugely, yes. And I mean, to go back a bit further, I mean, the thing was, my good old friend, great friend Pete Crowther at PS Publishing, it was initially his idea in a general sense. He thought, somebody could do a trilogy of supernatural terror. Well, actually, of course, I just have to say that Jeff Vandermeer hit me to that post with the very fine, the Annihilation trilogy. So he got in first, but because it took me several years to work out how one could do a trilogy of this sort. What was very important to me was that it shouldn't just be a very long novel chopped into 3 volumes. It had to have a reason to be in 3 volumes, and part of the reason is exactly what you've said, that it follows all the major characters really across most of their lives. So as you say, obviously Dominic and his 2 friends, Jim and Roberta Bobby, they grow up, change, particularly in Roberta's case. As the whole thing progresses, but equally the antagonist, the cult, which starts off as a small scale thing in the Trinity Church of the Spirit in a deconsecrated church in Blitz, Liverpool, in the 1950s, and pretty well is underground. As you say, by the final volume, it's out there in the open. Public dignitaries and celebrities belong to it quite openly. It's got charity status. It's got branches all over the world, and I've got a terrible feeling that that's not too unlikely. There's plenty of craziness out there in plain sight that seems to be almost accepted as a fact of everyday life now. And so I mean the plunge into irrationality has long been something that sort of terrified me, if you like, and particularly this sort of, well, not least there's people espousing a belief system that will, it'll answer all your questions so long as you give up the right to ask any. And that was part of what I was trying to do in the way of the world. But also, I did want to give this sense of, we keep using the term cosmic terror, but I have to in this case, and to see, could you preserve that in terms of something that was openly out there? And, well, I hope I brought that off.
I personally really like the little tidbit of, we wouldn't have actually called it a church, except that we needed to call it a church in America for tax purposes. And it's really something, right? And I'm like, there you go. That reads, that tracks. Sorry, everybody. Yeah. The other thing I liked was there's, in this 3rd book, at least, there's an interesting mixture of, technology and computers and, mobile phones, in addition to ancient texts or something that somebody at one point wrote on a scroll or a parchment. And, for me, there's a lot of it's just a little bit out of control. It's, and there's issues of I might have just glitched up my phone accidentally. I might have, the technology isn't totally in my control. And it started to make me think about some people's theories about the singularity, about, people getting to a point where they can change their bodies freely and things like that. Was that an obvious element to add, that in addition to the ancient texts, now we also have this additional technology in the ether that's somewhat out of control?
Oh gosh, yes. No, I think that certainly underlies the book. But I think it goes in my stuff. It goes all the way back to something like The Grin of the Dark in the around about 2005. I think that was, which is my first sort of big internet. The internet as being a sort of clearly. I mean, the internet's an enormous boon. I wouldn't be without it. Wouldn't be without my smartphone. iPhone. I mean, whenever I want to find out something, I can pretty well go to it and like as not, it will be there. But equally, the internet is this place where the monsters that we are come out into the open. They're all out there now. By God, and it seems like an extension of human consciousness. Without getting into too paranoid, although paranoid I am, God knows. There's the sense that we don't necessarily quite know what it's doing to our own personal consciousness, as well as being this huge shared version. And I think it's still evolving. So are we. But in what direction? Well, that's part of my theme, I think.
Yeah, it seems like at one point there was the theory that sunlight is the best disinfectant, and if we could, and obviously there were people that were selling this technology. If we could have everybody voicing their opinions all the time in a marketplace of ideas, that the best things would float to the top. And it seems like the opposite has sort of happened, of just like every lunatic now is yelling at us all the time on our smartphones, basically.
So we're finally seeing the consequences of an uncontrollable means of communication. I mean, all of us anti-censorship guys, and I am very much anti-censorship, but I'm certainly seeing the results of my attitudes, if you like. It's pretty frightening.
Yeah,
I'm curious.
Go on.
Are there any cases where you were, in the middle of writing a work where world events changed or shifted in a surprising way that impacted your writing? Specifically, what's in my head, of course, is you must have been in the middle of something when the pandemic broke out, and did that radically shift what you were working on, or do you just kind of push that to the sides and focus in on what you're?
It had to go to the side because the world, in a sense, the world of that novel. I'm trying to think which novel that would have been, actually. I suppose it would have been Somebody's Voice. I think I would have been writing that then. And given that a lot of that, well, it's a bit of a cop-out in a way, not a cop-out, I hope, but a lot of that does take place in several decades earlier. So that was one reason to have to take that into account. But I think I suppose I felt that the novel had to stay in the world in which it had begun, basically. I think it's a self-contained world. Now, in fact, I'll go a little bit further on this, because I basically felt for quite a time, because obviously one of the questions that's been circulating in the writing community is, do we now have to acknowledge the pandemic and write about it? Must we not incorporate it somehow? Now, my feeling is, well, you read, Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Virginia Woolf, E.M. Forster in the 1920s, you don't have much sense of Spanish flu, really. So in a sense, it seems to me, no, you don't have to. You don't have to incorporate it if you don't want to. You can write about a world in which it didn't exist. Whether you're going to write about a world that somehow now in which it doesn't exist, I don't know so much about that. But I did feel for quite a time that, I wouldn't use it. In a way, it just seemed to be potentially exploitative to use it anyway, just to put it in. Admittedly, okay, for the reasons of realism, maybe put it in, but for just in order to use it, maybe not. But I've got to admit that the novel that I've most recently completed in first draft, it won't be out until next year, I've got to rewrite it yet, a book called The Lonely Lands. I was some way into gathering, the material to start writing that. And I thought, well, actually, no. In fact, the pandemic is absolutely the obvious sort of background to this novel. I won't go into much detail about it, but suffice it to say that the novel did allow me to talk about the pandemic in ways that seem to me to be valid. And so, yes, it's in there. Now, whether it will be in anything else I write, I don't honestly know. I have no plans at the moment for it to be, but we'll see.
Fascinating. Yeah, that's great. Now, you use the word didn't want to be exploitative in there, and thinking about the towering monument that is your career, Ramsey, I was thinking, are there any subjects, as culture evolves, are there any subjects that you would have wanted to use in a horror story decades ago that you now feel you need to stay away from? Or, does horror need to be transgressive, and do you need to be going over those lines, or being willing to go over those lines all the time? Are there things you just don't want to use anymore?
I should say, just to come back to a little bit, one of your points, I don't think it has to be transgressive. I don't think it has to be anything in specific terms.
Okay.
It may be. I certainly don't think it shouldn't. I'm saying it's not saying that it shouldn't be transgressive, which would be nonsense. I mean, looking back now, there's a story in Scared Stiff, which is my kind of Tales of Sex and Death book. I mean, some folk find it erotic. I didn't really intend it that way. I was trying to find out what would happen to a horror story if you made the sex, which is often, implicit and underlying. If you made that explicit, would it rob it of its power? It seemed to me it probably didn't. There's one story called The Other Woman, which does sort of trade around rape fantasies, and whether I would write that now, I doubt it, frankly. But I'm not ashamed of it. I'll still leave it out there. I still think it's a valid story, but I don't know that I would go for it now. I've always said, and it's still true, that I wouldn't write about the Holocaust because I simply don't know enough about it. I certainly don't have enough experience that that would somehow hardly trump anybody else's. But it seems to me there are people who can write about it from experience, or certainly with more insight than I can bring. So no, but I guess I have written about the process of dehumanizing victims or scapegoat groups. I've certainly written about that. So to that extent, I suppose you could say I've written about that mindset. This particular little story called The Street Was Chosen, which is written in an entirely passive voice. It's a report of an experiment whose nature is only gradually apparent from the report itself. And that is absolutely about just making people into objects, with no names, just numbers and letters, and doing things, providing stimuli that will send them in various directions. Again, maybe that is I think it's tasty to say that's my Holocaust story, but it's my story about that kind of attitude to other people, put it that way. I've still sort of regret. You see, there's my old novel, The Nameless. In passing, it refers to the Moors murderers, Brady and Hindley, who murdered several children in Manchester. Now, the characters within the story, just in one scene, just refer to them partly because in the year in which that scene is taking place, these two young mothers would most certainly be aware of it and would regard it as being a particular sort of background terror, if you like. I'm still not sure when I should have put that in. On the other hand, there's a story called Chucky Comes to Liverpool, which is about the sort of panic that ensued after the murder of James Bulger in Liverpool. A toddler was murdered by two 10-year-olds, and infamously the court judge blamed video nasties, or specifically blamed the Child's Play movies, which, in fact, it turned out had never been brought up in evidence, and apparently the prosecuting people had no sense that kids had ever watched these films. But there was this huge sort of panic and tabloid campaign to get these videos banned, particularly in Britain, in Liverpool, I think. So that story did sort of deal with that panic, if you like, and to that extent, I think that's valid, and I do think that it was a kind of reasonable way to treat of the theme. I suppose one final thing, child abuse, actual sexual abuse. I certainly felt there was no reason for me to write about that, but ultimately I did in somebody's voice, because it did seem to me to be an important theme and a central theme to that particular book. I think I did so responsibly. I hope so, anyway.
Interesting. Like on that point, Way of the Worm, there's at least a point where someone is accused of that. Way of the Worm doesn't, graphically go into that at all. Yes. One thing some of us, wrestle with is the modern concept of content warnings. And particularly for horror, I wrestle with the desire for the horror to be a shocking surprise that you didn't expect, versus some people's desires nowadays that certain things they should be warned about in advance. And for example, like in Way of the Worm, without saying what it is, chapter 7 is titled A Family Secret. And I feel for me, if I'd had a banner up front that warned me what the secret was going to be, then the effect would be lost. How do you feel about content warning type stuff like that? Is that antithetical to horror, or is that an okay tool in some cases?
I don't think it's antithetical, but I think my own attitude, frankly, is that there are folk who, if they want to be warned about things like this, just as for instance, if you went to see a film like Irreversible, you know that one, the Gaspar Noé film, which has an 8-minute rape scene at the centre of the film, which is absolutely crucial to it, and it's shot in a single take. It's absolutely terrifying. It's fair to say it was apparently directed by the actress Monica Bellucci, the victim in the film. So the prolongation was partly her idea. In fact, I think it was largely her idea. But I think it might be reasonable to expect to have some sort of warning, at least on the certificate. Not on the title card on the screen, but on the poster or on the. And I think with films in Britain at least, I think in America too with the MPAA, you can go online and look on their site. There'll be a summation of what the sort of content within the film is that has gained that certificate. But you've got to go and look. I think equally, if you had it on a book, say in some little box, kind of a text box on the book, maybe on the back cover, bottom left-hand corner or something like that. So you know where to look, but also you know where to look away from if you are, like we are, I think, people who don't want to be warned in advance. I think something was identified that way. It's there if you want to see it, but it's equally there if you don't want to look at it. Then yes, I would say yeah. And I think in the case, or also because that's what the blurb can be about, if not more. And I did make sure that in the case of somebody's voice, that it was clear from the blurb that child abuse was involved, because I did feel that was something that people might want to be warned about, some of the readers.
Very thoughtful. Very thoughtful. Thank you for that. Fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
So, the other thing that we wanted to talk about is the other book that was published just a couple months ago is a republication of your Far Away and Never, which I think DMR Books, right? End of last year was republished. And so that, if for viewers that don't know, that is a collection of specifically fantasy stories in your world of Tond. And about half of them feature the swordsman Ryer that we love. And those stories, I guess, were originally written for the Swords and Wizardry series. And I'll also say this has a new. It's promoted as having a new story in it. Is the new story something that you wrote recently, or is that something from your file drawer?
Sadly, it's not quite a new story. It's new to that book, but it was my sort of Lovecraftian, or at least Well, yes, who's in it now? Is it not? I think Daoloth, good old Daoloth, I think he shows up actually, or an avatar.
Okay. Okay.
It's called A Madness from the Vault. It has been reprinted before, but not here. But no, I wouldn't want anybody to run away with the idea that you're going to get an unpublished story, because sadly, no, you're not.
But they're super high quality. People should get it anyway. If they haven't read all these already, they should get it anyway.
Well, I'll give you a little bit of background if you like. I mean, Tond, now you see, Tond began life in that very first story that is, the new story within that volume, A Madness from the Vault. Now, that was originally written for the inhabitant of the lake. It's one of the stories that I intended to put in there. But I finished it, was wholly unhappy with it. Didn't think it worked very much at all. I mean, it was an attempt, I think, to be more Clark Ashton Smith than Lovecraft, actually, and to invent this other world, Tond, which is something like, one of Clark Ashton Smith's mythic setting, Zothique or something like that, or for that matter, his other planets as well. And so I didn't use it. I didn't even send it to Daoloth, in fact, and it languished until it went into a fanzine. And then a few years later, I was asked it was Mead and Penny Frierson, who did this huge, wonderful, glossy, I suppose technically a fan publication, just called HPL, that came out in the early 70s. They asked me if I'd got anything for that hadn't been published. So I went back, looked at this story, still loathed it. What I did was I actually rewrote it completely from start to finish, and took them that version, and they liked it and used it. And that's the version that is in Far Away and Never. Now, a few years passed, not many, we're then in 1973, 74, I suppose, and horror is not selling. So my agent, Kirby Macaulay, good old Kirby, sadly long gone, or a few years gone now, said, he suggested I diversify, try science fiction, try fantasy. Well, I found a bit of science fiction, it was terrible, turgid, terrible stuff. So I want to go at fantasy. And I wrote this one story, the first one. Before that, there was just one that I did off the cuff, which was The Stages of the God, which is in there too. But then came the idea of doing, a sword and sorcery hero, who is, as you say, Raya, who is central to 4 stories in that, the major part of that book, in fact. And I wrote that story, oh, good Lord, about 16,000 words long. Sent it to Kirby, who duly sold to Andy Offord for that anthology series you mentioned. Andy said, yes, he liked it, but he felt it was a little bit long. And so could I cut it down a bit? So I duly looked at it. Yes, it was. It was not really that, but it was a bit sort of stodgy. So I took about 4,000 words out of it, actually, which Andy was astounded by, because that was about a quarter of the story. And he duly used it. And then he carried on doing the series and asked me for more, so I duly did more. So 4 altogether, and then the series ended, sadly. And so I've never come back to old Raya. Whether I ever shall, well, who knows? Maybe I'll give him another shot if the opportunity comes along. But of course, it will now be, good Lord, you see, it'll now be nearly 40 years on. So, well, probably you'll be walking around with a stick.
Hopefully a sword cane. Now we promised. We're fantasy horror gaming aficionados, and we're going to hold the promise of not asking you any questions about gaming. But the Swords and Wizardry series was foundational to our favorite fantasy game of Dungeons and Dragons. It was specifically called out as among the most important influences the entire fantasy community, as a matter of fact. So one thing I wanted to ask you, for those of us of a particular age, I mean, there was a moment, how different is horror from fantasy, really? Because when I was growing up in a rural area in the United States, there were the bookstores didn't have 2 separate sections. There was just like one section that was horror and fantasy together. And if one reads like an early analysis like Moorcock's Wizardry and Wild Romance, I mean, at that point he's calling it all romance, actually. And do you really see a big difference between those genres, or is that just a historical accident?
Well, I think there's certainly an overlap. And of course, you also have those writers who did both. I mean, the huge example, obviously, is Lovecraft with all his dreamland stories as well as his horror stories. Fritz Leiber, clearly, the Fafford Grey Mouse on the one hand, and his overt supernatural on the other. I suppose. Well, you see, as soon as I start defining things, I realise, no, I'm wrong. So if I come up with a definition, before it's out of my mouth, I realise that it really doesn't cover it. So I was about to say, fantasy probably takes place in a fantasy world. It's more likely to. Well, I think it's more likely to, certainly. Whether it be, I don't know, Tolkien or Philip Pullman, but then Pullman to some extent is located in something akin to the real world. And when you come along to something like Alan Garner, and you have wonderful stuff with unicorns at large, or one unicorn at large in the back alleys of lower class, working class Manchester. I just say lower class, I didn't mean that, but there you are. I've probably booked forever there. But I come from it myself. That's why I could say it anyway. But the sense of a fantastic creature in a completely realistic environment. But clearly, that's fantasy as well. So I suppose there's certainly overlap. Let me put it the other way. I mean, some of Clark Ashton Smith's best stories, is the Abominations of Yondo fantasy or horror? Well, I think it's both, and a whole bunch of his other stories too. Fritz Leiber's first one of the Adept's Gambit has a lot of overtly horrific stuff in it and very dark stuff. Because in the original draft, he actually put in references to the Lovecraft mythos, but later took them out. But, there's certainly a fair amount of overlap. I suppose the fantastic is less likely to be horrific. I suppose that's it may have a sense of terror, but perhaps it stops short of horror. But then again, we then go to all those definitions, because for me, horror encompasses it all, from just disquiet and psychological disturbance, all the way to through to the uncanny, the cosmic, to the graphic, to body horror. So I'm contradicting myself as I speak. I basically just old bastard rambling on. So stop me doing it.
We like to think of it as Ramsey containing multitudes, is what we like to think.
Demons, yes, absolutely. The demons are in there. That's for sure.
I mean, it's certainly I was reading very recently The Pit of Wings, and obviously both fantasy and horror, and I know that Dan has suggested that most fantasy, if explored too deep, eventually turns into horror. And I wonder if that's I don't know, when you think of like those components of fantasy, right? That if you contextualize them in a realistic setting, or how a real person might react to them, you go, actually those elements are actually quite horrific.
Yes, I think that's right. There's one extraordinary example of this, actually, that I just not terribly well known. I mean, you probably know that. Do you know Mary Norton's stories of the Borrowers? I mean, actually,
yes.
Studio Ghibli did the Arrietty film. In fact, is based on those. So they're basically tiny people who live in people's houses, behind the skirting board. All that, and the stories are told from their viewpoint, and they're in constant peril from the big people who are us, basically, and even that's got a sort of edge of paranoia, but they're essentially fantasy. Now, there was a short story she wrote called Paul's Tale, in which he turns the entire thing round, and it's about this young boy and his aunt, and he's convinced of this little person running about that she can't see. And eventually she maybe does see it. And this is just a sort of paranoid nightmare. And it's the same basic material, but it's just given that half turn. And it turns into something completely different.
There's a story in an anthology that I loved being a math lecturer called Mathonauts, and I cannot remember the name of it, and I cannot remember the author, but it was that, except there's an infinite regress. So there's small people and there's big people, and the big people are small people to even bigger people who are small people to even bigger people in both directions. And I'm like, I do not want to. And that's truly terrifying.
Yeah, I see that. I see that.
Good point. So we keep coming back to Lovecraft, right? And, so he was influential to all of us, frankly. And, many of us wrestle with, and I've identified, I always say that he's basically the root of all of the literature that has really affected me, up to now. And many of us wrestle with his cultural influence. And I've seen it written that you yourself, Ramsey, have in the past disavowed him and then re-embraced him. What do you feel like the status of Lovecraft is nowadays for you?
Well, I mean, to me, he's among the most important writers of the field, certainly. For two reasons. First of all, I mean, this whole parody notion of Lovecraft that many of his detractors purvey, but also I have to say, even some admirers, that it's all purple prose and it's saying that things are indescribable. Well, obviously that clearly is not the case. You look at the indescribable thing, you look at something like the Dunwich Horror. or At the Mountains of Madness. They're very detailed descriptions of his creatures. In other, I mean, in something like The Color Out of Space, it got this wonderful sort of image of alienness, which doesn't need to be described. It's conveyed. It doesn't need to be described in physical detail, although he certainly conveys plenty of that in the course of the story. The other thing, but the thing for me is that, in fact, it's absolutely the opposite. Okay, there are stories like The Hound, which are pretty florid in the telling of the outsider, if you like, to some extent. But many of his greatest stories, the prose is extraordinarily carefully modulated. It moves all the way from very sober documentary style into sort of gradual unease and so forth, into the occasional real explosion of prose. But those are very carefully prepared for. And I did a long piece on some of the stories, and in particular the Rats in the Walls. And that actually seems to me to be a story about language. I mean, there's a line in that which the narrator has, I think it's, I must go very carefully now and choose my words. But of course, he's been doing that all the way through the story. Lovecraft has, as is typical of him. And that's a story about the breakdown of language as much as anything else. Toward the end of the story, literally, the language comes apart, and it flies into incoherence. And it's an extraordinary sense. And that's the other thing you see with Lovecraft for me, is this sense of structure in his best work. Very careful, gradual accretion of detail, from suggestiveness to gradual explicitness. And I mean, that, to me, actually, that shift from the suggestive to the explicit, if it's done in a horror story, it's one of the most difficult transitions to make, I think. And, it needs extraordinary care in timing and choice of words and so forth. And, very difficult to bring up, but Lovecraft does it time after time, I think. Now, obviously, we can't really ignore, the whole issue of racism in Lovecraft, and there's no question there is some there. But I think, the moment he seems to be, pilloried for it quite a bit, it's a bit as though, Wagner were being regarded as being an anti-Semite and nothing more than that. Now, Wagner certainly was an anti-Semite, for sure, but he's a great deal more significant than that. And so I think it's the case with Lovecraft, and I think in the same way, eventually things will sort of balance out, and there will be a more balanced view of Lovecraft as there now is of Wagner.
Let me throw up a comment here from Tony Lovell that we have in a live chat. So Tony's saying, I read Lovecraft during the lockdowns, and he was a great comfort. Nothing like modern life, and much more moving in places than I remembered. So it's these things go in cycles, and I'm wondering if you might be correct, Ramsey, that pendulum might swing back.
I think so.
I think so. Yeah.
I think just going with Tony's comment more generally, I do find that there's at the moment, and probably more than ever, we get this question asked, why do you write horror when there's so much horror in the world, or words to that effect? I think there are various different answers to that. One of which is, if there is, and indeed we know that yes, there is. Well, why wouldn't you write about it in one sense? Why would you not reflect reality in some way? But I also think, that horror fiction doesn't necessarily deal with that kind of horror. That often it is trying to deal with something else, with the psychological, with the uncanny, the numinous even. It's attempting to touch upon that in somebody like, say, Arthur Machen. And so I think it's not the same thing. And I think that's really the answer. And so it can, even in the present nightmare we seem to be experiencing, it can be sort of elevating, and let me just pin down that. Now, I wasn't meaning elevated horror, that dreadful term that I absolutely repudiate. I mean the horror can sort of elevate the imagination, but this elevated horror thing. I mean, I don't think I've been accused of doing that, but I've certainly been accused of transcending the genre. Well, I mean, I don't. I mean, very kind of people to think this, but I don't think I do. I think if I'm as good as they say, then I'm perhaps being worthy of the genre, but that's quite different. That's not transcending it, doing something quite different.
Fascinating. Fascinating take. Paul, would you have a question? Because I have
no. Sorry,
I got to ask.
Really fascinating thought, and I just love the idea there of the bar of what the genre is, perhaps being lifted entirely rather than expanding the genre rather than transcending the genre.
Well, yes, I think expanding is absolutely fine. I think I've certainly tried to do that. There's certainly people like Lovecraft, Fritz Leiber and so forth, Robert Aikman. Of course, he didn't say he wrote horror, but still, who've most emphatically expanded. Steve King, Peter Straw, many. There's too many to count. This is why I never like that question, who do you rate now? Because there's so many I do. I always feel, oh, God, I've left them out, So let me just say this. I know you're not asked, but I'll say it anyway. I actually do think we're in something of a golden age of the field right now. A tremendous amount of talent, I mean, more as much as there's ever been in any one period that I'm aware of, and I'm very excited by it.
Fantastic. That's great. Now so I do have to ask one more question about the olden days, and that is obvious. And you mentioned August Derleth a little bit earlier, and you worked with him on your initial publications, with him obviously publishing horror at Arkham House. And so I've seen it said that he gave you advice, which isn't too surprising as a publisher doing a writer. What was the one or two pieces of most important advice that Derleth gave you?
Oh gosh, well, certainly. I mean, it was the old, show don't tell. I have to say, because I did sort of summarize a lot. I mean, having imitated Lovecraft to a fault in these early stories. Also, certainly don't overwrite. He said this, and by God, was he ever right? Would you like me to perform a brief excerpt, because I've done it so often I can do this? It will demonstrate what he was talking about. Yes. Well,
yes, please.
I mean, in the early draft of The Church in High Street, which was the first story of mine he ever published, and he actually did edit that. He didn't edit anything else except for the very, very occasional word in The Inhabitant and nothing in Demons by Daylight. But this certainly, it was still too overwritten. But the point was that the version I sent him was not the version he commented upon initially. That was the overwritten one. Now, there is in that story a moment where the narrator discovers his friend, who's now been made away with by the creatures, has meant to send him a telegram, but which he never has sent, because he's been dragged away instead. And the telegram, unless I can do this verbatim, having done it so often. You remember this is a telegram, and it goes to Richard Dodd. Come at once to Kingsport. It was Kingsport, you see, because I was using Lovecraftian settings then. Come at once to Kingsport. You were needed urgently by me here as protection against agencies which may kill me, or worse, if you do not come immediately. Will explain as soon as you get here, ... But what is this that shambles unspeakably down the corridor toward this room? It cannot be that abomination that I glimpsed in the nitrous vault below the church in Asquith Page. Yeah, Schopenhauer,
Bravo.
That's great.
You know why I needed an editor.
Some of our favorite writers constantly think they would have been a lot better with a good editor.
Oh well.
Yeah.
We're not going to name them.
That's spectacular. That's spectacular. I guess. Okay, so here's a last question. I mean, you've mentioned films a couple times, and we were talking about movies before we started the show, even. So, films are important to you, right? You know, the main character here in Way of the Worm, he was a lecturer in film in book 2. I notice in your acknowledgments, you say you were treating yourself to a rare film at the end of every day to treat yourself for succeeding at writing. And you know, the cover of the book even has a complimentary blurb by Guillermo del Toro.
Yes.
When you're writing, you know, how much influence are films having on your writing? Are you thinking about, like, what is this going to look like in film if someday this gets turned into a movie? Are you thinking about that kind of thing while you're writing?
No, never. No. I mean, I think exclusively in language. Actually, it's finding the right phrasing, really. And so, no. I mean, I may visualize it, but I don't visualize it in terms of how somebody else would do it. I mean, I'd be fascinated to see that. Obviously, to some extent, I have seen that because there've been some films made from my stuff. I actually have to say, Guillermo has bought a short story for his television series, so that's going to be fun to watch for sure. Down There, a story called Down There. But in terms of, film tends to be, something I love. I've loved the cinema from very early on, and particularly, here in Britain, in the 50s and early 60s, around then, you couldn't get to see a horror movie unless you could pass for being 16 years old. You see, nearly everything had an X certificate. So I wasn't until 14 that I was able to go and catch up on all these films I read about in Famous Monsters, and I duly did for years, But I soon branched out into Ingmar Bergman and last year in Marienbad and so forth and so on. And I've loved all manner of films, basically. And in fact, I have to say that P.S. they're very soon bringing out my collected video reviews from Video Watchdog. So that'll be quite a chunky book sometime. About May, I think we're bringing that out. But I know you didn't ask me this specifically, but the film doesn't really influence my stuff very much. I don't. But there are moments. There's a scene in the moment in Carnival of Souls I loved so much that I kind of put a version into Incarnate. And there's a scene in a mediocre Danny Kaye comedy thriller called Knock on Wood, where a body is sort of pinned to the back of the door, and the gag is Danny Kaye doesn't, he thinks it's a coat hanging up there. But the audience laughed immoderately, and that, when I was 10 years old, I was sort of terrified out of my wits, basically. And that stayed with me for so long that I put a version of that in The Nameless. There have been moments where I've, put in favourite images, but on the whole, no. Film doesn't hugely influence the way I do it, I don't think. Fascinating.
So one single time I worked on a feature film in Massachusetts. It was actually, it doesn't matter what the production was. This was years ago. And I was working as an animal wrangler. And so I was shipped into this island off the coast of Massachusetts to be the only person on the isolated island taking care of the animals and the horses and cows and pigs and stuff overnight. And I took some Lovecraft with me, and I happened to be reading the Dunwich Horror, maybe for the second time, and at night, alone, and I was reading the descriptions of the coast, and I looked up, and I was like, and I realized I'm off the coast of Ipswich. And it dawned on me that Dunwich is based, and I'm like, I'm actually literally where Dunwich is supposed to be, and I'm alone overnight. And I should have thought of that before I came here.
Absolutely.
And I wouldn't have had that.
Well,
go ahead.
You wouldn't be without it, though, right? The suitable surroundings, as Ambrose Bierce had it. What could be better? There you go. You did it, and you lived to tell the tale, more to the point. Well done.
I did, and I only had to wrestle with one pig while I was there that night.
We don't want to know about your sexual habits.
I deserve that so much from Ramsey Campbell.
Oh dear!
All right, sir.
we are running close to the end of the show here. Ramsey, I just wanted to ask: is there anything, any closing thoughts, or anything that we didn't touch on here that you were really hoping that we would present to our audience?
Oh Lord, hours worth. But we can't. Maybe we'll do it again another time. Why not? Let's do it. Let's do it for the next book, something like that. So we'll save it for then. Because there will be another technically, I think, another cosmic horror novel coming in September called Fellstones. And about then, I'll determine to shock you if I can. So let me just tell you that also coming maybe this year, but I'm nearly finished it anyway, a 70,000 word monograph and appreciation of the Three Stooges.
Amazing. Amazing.
So you see, I'm really saying,
twist our arm. We will. Twist our arm. We will have to have Ramsey back on to tell us about those completely different types of writing that he does. That's fantastic.
Maybe it's a horror story about the Three Stooges. I'm actually excited about that.
I can't hear you right now. Is that me?
Oh, dear.
I'm not sure. Dan,
that's me.
That's Dan. Okay, great. You're back with us, Dan. Little glitch of the internet. Thankfully, came at the very end.
And is it still him, or has he been replaced?
You'll never know.
Dan, last chance. Any final questions before we close out?
Just that I will be looking forward to the hours of commentary that we'll have from Ramsey in the future the next time he's on.
Excellent. Viewers, if you want to find some links to Ramsey's latest work, I'm sure that is in the video description here on YouTube. Please check it out, as well as where to look for his upcoming book. There we go. There it is, The Way of the Worm. Please drop us some comments in the video description here on YouTube to tell us what you think, or questions that we should have posed. Should we be so lucky as to have Mr. Campbell on our show again in the future?
Yeah, definitely. And there is a link to the Flame Tree Press publisher that's on our YouTube description right now. Big thanks to Flame Tree Press for making it possible for us to get in touch with Ramsey. They've been enormously helpful for making this show happen, actually. And of course, if you're new to the show here, remember that you can like, follow, and subscribe to us, The Wandering DMs. We are on YouTube and Twitch and Twitter and Facebook and GitHub and TikTok. And we do have the handle Wandering DMs, so look for us there, and you'll get updates for our other shows and guests and the next time that Ramsey will be on.
If you prefer to listen to our show in audio-only podcast format, you can get those podcasts at our website at wanderingdms.com. They're also carried by all the major podcast carriers, such as iTunes, Google Podcast, Stitcher, Pocket Cast, all sorts of places. If you're listening to this show on one of those sites, please stop and take a moment to rate and review us on that site. That helps other users of that site find us, and we really appreciate it.
We really do. And of course, huge thanks to our patrons who support the Wandering DM show. And if you would like to join them, please visit patreon.com/wanderingdms. See a couple different tiers, a bunch of benefits like our live Discord chat. And in about 10 minutes, we'll be on our Discord server to continue the conversation about Way of the Worm with our viewers. One of the favorite things we do every Sunday. Look for our other shows coming up Tuesday and Thursday of this week, as always. But most important of all, enormous thanks to Ramsey Campbell for making his valuable time available to us today. Thanks so much for being with us, Ramsey.
Paul and Dan, thank you very much for having me. It was great. Let's do it again.
Absolutely.
We agree. Don't forget, we are live every Sunday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, so please join us again next week for another thought-provoking discussion.
We'll see you then.